There it goes. Welcome, everybody. Today is, well, it's not Tuesday, as the sign says. It's actually Thursday, 15th. This is the Podman Community Cabal meeting. We meet on the third Thursday of every month, and we discuss any kind of topic that we have for design, specifically more towards the design kind of things for Podman. And I'm not speaking well at all today, so I'm going to keep this real short and sweet. I have a HackMD up for taking meeting notes. If I say anything or you want to add something, do that as we go along. Feel free to edit that. I will try to keep the note complete, but I have often missed things. And if you have things that you'd like to add to it, also please sign in if you have not already within the HackMD to let us know that you're here. And given that, we have Matt talking first about Podman Default Network and enabling DNS by default. Matt, take it away.
All right, sure. So we have discussed this before, but no action was actually taken. So I'm bringing it back around to see if we can actually get consensus and get this done. So basically, for Docker compatibility reasons, we do not enable DNS on the default network, meaning that any container created without explicitly specifying a network and you haven't created that network beforehand, you will not be able to resolve other containers by their name. So if you have a container that's created in a network that you made, you can access other containers by their name using the integrated DNS solution. However, if you never created a network and you just do a Podman run, you cannot access other containers by their name. This is largely because Docker didn't turn on DNS resolution in their default network for unclear reasons. I don't think it was performance, but it might have been. We are considering turning DNS on by default in the Podman default network. My opinion is that we should do it unless there's a compelling reason not to. I would like to open it up to whether anyone has a compelling reason not to, because this is...
So, yeah, I was going to add some reasons not to, not saying that I don't want it. So in the past, we had problems with custom DNS resolvers. So that was fixed in 4.4 that you can set a custom resolver for otherwise DNS for a single container. So that's gone. But another thing is, with generally speaking, we had quite a few bugs that were only visible in some environments. So if you make it the default, DNS might be broken. And yeah, lastly, it's another process that might not be needed for many people. And there is the Podman is not a daemon thing. And then you have a DNS server running, which you may not want. So that's the reasons not to. Just bringing it up.
I would like to add a few. So I think what Paul is getting, I'll just outright say it, it will be a performance hit because none of our has to wait for Aardvark to acknowledge both up and down that something happened. And there is an extra service that needs to be run. I would have concerns turning it on while CNI plugins are still available, because the DNS name implementation is even less performant and would advertise the fact that that previous DNS implementation and the new one are so vastly different that I can't in my head deal with having to contend on that. Seems like it would be difficult. So that's two. And I think the third one that sits with me is that most of the problems that we had about DNS complaints relative to this issue was actually the fact that we ran Docker Compose on the default network. And the default network was didn't have DNS, and therefore something like Docker Compose, which in Docker actually did create new networks, which were DNS enabled. When we did it, it ran on the default network. DNS was not enabled. That's where we were getting pinged quite a bit. So the
that
fact that
sounds wrong to me. We've never.
That's yeah. That didn't happen with Docker Compose, as far as
Yeah.
I recall. I think that's more Podman Compose thing, if
no,
anything.
it was Docker Compose.
No, you might be thinking of PlayCube, but this was not Docker Compose. Docker Compose never had this issue.
PlayCube for sure. I believe Docker Compose we did not initially support the network, but whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is
the initial problem was that it's not installed. Like if DNS name and stuff like that was not installed, then you wouldn't have it. Stuff like that.
Yep.
Which
I guess this maybe then just falls under what Paul was saying, which is DNS is complex, and that's where the saying "it's always DNS" comes from. And the more DNS enablement you do by default, the more open you make yourself for problems. So I would have concerns. The compatibility for me is the big one.
I don't necessarily know if people would notice. The fact that Docker doesn't do something and we do, we've added things in the past, and very rarely do people complain about them. I'd also like to clarify about the performance. We would strictly be speaking about startup performance. This is not going to be a substantial effect on your runtime performance. I don't believe that we have any numbers that suggest that Aardvark is substantially slower than just using the system resolver. This would purely be added time for
Correct.
containers coming up and going down.
Coming up and going down would be the two actions.
I'm actually not so sure on that. It's extra latency, and there are still an open bug where sometimes Aardvark DNS seems to stall for like up to 60 seconds or something before the response comes in. So
it's extra latency for the first request. After that, it caches. Honestly, this might be
upstream requests. Upstream requests are not cached, as far as I know.
They are not. I thought
I'm
they were
not
using
sure.
a caching name server. Like we have to investigate this further, but I'm pretty sure that we cache, and if we do, we might even be more performant with DNS in terms of actual runtime. Aside from bugs, bugs would be the big thing.
Yeah, right. I think the latency wouldn't be an issue, but the bugs are, and I don't see a strong reason to enable it. Let's focus on the points. Why would we want to enable it? And so far, I haven't seen a reason other than there are few users who run into this and want it. But
I think it's fairly common. I wouldn't describe it as few. I'm also concerned about the startup, about the consequences, but I think it's a fairly common thing. You know, why can't my containers talk to each other? Why does DNS not work?
yeah, but where did they get the idea from? Because Docker never did it. So that's
Exactly.
my point, which is kind of confusing, I guess.
I agree. I think given that it's a default to Docker, or of Docker, people can't really get angry at Podman, but I also think that it's a valid assumption that it just works by default. I think many people just have the assumption that, you know, these things work.
I'll also say that in Docker, it's fairly trivial to change the default network if you want to. Well, change. It's more like delete the default network and recreate it. Whereas in theory, we do it, but it's not documented anywhere. And the JSONing process to create this new default network file is not exactly trivial. So
Actually, somebody wrote a blog really recently and documented exactly how to do this.
it's not in the man pages. If it's not in the man pages, it's not documentation.
I
That seems
think I had to
fairly
go.
easy.
I think I had to look in the man page in order to write down how to do it, but we can fix that. So what I'm speaking of is the question. This question comes up a lot, and so after the last time it came up, I documented how to make a new network be your default network, and therefore it is DNS enabled. So it was more of an opt-in approach.
Is it? Oh, okay, go forward.
Go ahead, Giuseppe. I can hold my comment.
Yeah, I was just, isn't at this point also a security thing to consider, because now we don't allow it, and if we would allow, then all of a sudden containers can reach each other, and maybe they were not meant to be reachable. Like, could be, well, be reachable
That's
from another container that is not.
That's a point, but it would only be the name resolution. If you already allow traffic on IP basis, then you already have this issue, Just, okay, he can discover it via name, but if it's a real attacker, I don't think the name matters.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it. I mean, you could do a dictionary attack against DNS, but you could just as easily just search the subnet. Doing an Nmap is probably faster than trying to dictionary attack DNS.
So one thing we could do is, if I do like Paul's recommendation that we should be looking at why we make this change as opposed to maybe why not. And nothing is super compelling to me other than the questions that we get and have to answer. I would say that I would be open to some sort of mechanism to opt in to such a configuration, but I don't know how much that differs to just making a new network and setting it as the default on that particular one. I would also say if we do is find consensus that we should do this, and we find a good reason, I would like for us to measure what the ramifications could be, so that we're not speculating on whether there is or isn't, or how much. I think that's a fair thing to do.
I mean, if we want to improve the opt-in situation that you described, with just make it a simple config field in containers.conf or something, instead of having to change the name or something, which you recommended, which is, for me, it's always, it doesn't matter if it's 2,3 or something, that's how I think, but I can understand if somebody else thinks just having a simple way, one line change is the preferred way. Then
I agree. The one thing I don't like about containers.conf in that sense is that it requires knowledge on where containers.conf lives in order to do it, as opposed to something like Podman Network update default DNS enabled type commands, something that where it controls it. But I'm 100% with you, Paul. So Matt, to keep the conversation going, well, what is the compelling reason to turn this on?
I view it as a straight enhancement over what Docker does. You can say that it adds latency. I will counter by saying that outside of a few very specific applications that are already moving to host networking, nobody really cares about milliseconds on startup latency. time to user interactive container, we're already fast in the Docker. I don't see a significant reason not to add a few milliseconds to get more functionality by default. Basically, to summarize, I view this as a straight enhancement over Docker, and we have a history of making those whenever we can.
We do. Does one of the problems with the new networks? So, are you suggesting that this would be only for the new backends, the Netavark Aardvark backend?
Sure. I mean, we have separate default networks for CNI and Netavark. There's no reason that we can't have the Netavark code do this and the CNI code not do it.
So there would be a difference between default behaviors on the default networks of the two backends we support.
Yes.
Okay. And do we for a while there, several distributions hadn't caught up with our Rust implementations and packages. Do we know that in fact has happened? Because if we make a change like this, we may be cutting them off at the knees.
I mean, we already have to worry about that considering we deprecated CNI, 2 months ago?
No, we put a deprecation announcement out.
Deprecation announcement and deprecation are effectively the same thing. The distros are on notice that they have to move. But Valentin, has Reinhardt gotten Netavark Aardvark packaged yet? I think
It's
so.
packaged, yeah. Debian upstream, like SID is packaged. Arch is packaged. Alpine is packaged. I think pretty much the common stuff.
SUSE was close behind us. Is that true, Valentin?
Can you repeat that?
SUSE should be in good shape, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes they're Podman lands faster in Tumbleweed than in Fedora.
But one thing to consider is that Aardvark DNS is not a hard dependency right now. You don't need to have it installed to use Podman if you don't need the DNS functionality. And if we turn it on by default, we might need to have it.
Well, we would need to at least account for it not being there. In which case, it would just be falling back to CNI, which we're saying now wouldn't.
No, I'm saying you want to use Netavark, but not the DNS part. So you
I
install
understand.
Aardvark DNS because you have some embedded distro and you care about space or something like that.
So there would be essentially a third behavior, which is that DNS is enabled for the default network, but only if Aardvark's present.
Something like that.
Yeah. This is starting to get hard to explain.
What happens right now if I try and do a Podman network create on a system with Netavark but no Aardvark? Do we get a DNS-enabled network that just doesn't work?
I think you get a warning on runtime that it didn't find Aardvark DNS.
Okay, so there's precedent then.
At this point, I think we need to hear from other people to break the logjam, because I'm not seeing this tipping one way or another yet. We know Dan is in favor of it.
I hate the extra latency, but I'm in favor of having the ease of use of contacting, especially so if it's a one-line change to turn off if you're
Would, if we did this, and this is maybe a question to Paul, since he and I have been the sort of the counter argument so far. Paul, how would you feel about this if this was planned for Podman 5? Where we could, CNI was no longer an option, and I'm actually somewhat surprised Valentin isn't jumping up and down about this being a breaking change for users.
So I think the 5.0 I would be fine with this. I'm not sure if it's too soon for like bugs or something, and yeah, I think 5.0 would be fine for me, definitely.
I mean, the deal on the bugs is the only way we can force bugs out of the closet is to
But
force
another
people to
point
use
is the classic sampling bias. We only hear about people who want it, not from people who don't want it. So if you turn it on, do we get the same response from people saying, why is it on? I don't know.
I don't think so, or I would be surprised, because we're adding something, we're not taking something away. This is why I'm also not jumping up and down because of backwards incompatibility. But one thing that worries me a little bit are the statements regarding reliability of the DNS, because if we don't feel uncomfortable with that, we shouldn't ship it. So since we shipped it, I think we should feel comfortable enabling it by default. It's a completely different conversation, but if concerns about reliability and things like that would be a deal breaker, then I think we should have a follow-up conversation on that.
I think that's engineer talk. But I do think that measuring impact is probably more important to me. But I also like the idea of being able to ramp up with an announcement related to Podman 5, not for marketing reasons, but for people tend to pay more attention to major versions and changes than point level.
The thing is, we cannot do it for CNI because it would break the DNS flag behavior, sort of. Like
Yeah.
This would be one more sentence in the docs. This will only work for NetApp Arc. I think what's important, or what I care about, is for it to be configurable such that people who might not like the minimal performance impacts can turn it off, especially in embedded. I'm not even sure whether embedded deployments would ship NetApp Arc or Artwork.
Yeah, like the config option is a good idea regardless of on by default or off by default.
All right,
So maybe
so that's one thing I'm going to take a note on then, is that we can implement that pre-5.0 for sure. We all agree that that's a good idea. I think we don't agree about is how you do it, but we can use the normal process for that. Or we could use our Cabal time today.
Yeah, I'm in favor of doing that. And then if there's a config switch somewhere, distributions are free to choose the defaults however they want.
So, given the conversation, could we drive a compromise of, yes, we should do this, but at 5.0 and with the configurable opt-out? Or did the proponents of doing this want it in 4.5?
I think 5.0 is perfectly reasonable. I just wanted to have some sort of consensus because this has been sitting for probably 6 months.
Let's hear somebody say no. I don't like this idea. And anyone want to? Okay. I know there's a question in the crowd too, but do we want to discuss how we should do the opt-in out?
I think we can use the time. So
Okay. As I said, though, my one thing about things like that go into containers.conf is that you got to know where that is in order to do it and what to look for. The containers.conf file is very descriptive. I don't have a concern once you're in there. I guess the question is for something like this on my mind, and I don't have an answer, is should you be able to opt out using Podman as opposed to having to go into a file and edit it?
I mean, pretty much all config options are in there, and that's the you as user, if you want to change a behavior, you have to change the config file. I think that's a common expectation. So
Okay. Anyone else want to add to it?
The only difference I would say between us and Docker is that in Docker, if the default network doesn't exist, but there is a network that exists, it will just switch the default to that network. So we don't allow people to delete the default, which is what it is.
doesn't allow
That's
it
the only-
too.
I'm pretty sure at least 2 years ago, Docker did allow it. I might have changed since then, but I'm 99% sure that I was able to delete the Docker network.
I'm 99% sure that I exactly checked how it behaved when I rewrote the stuff, which was later than 2 years ago. So
yeah, it's possible that they changed, but as long as we're compatible with what Docker's doing, I think we're probably okay. So
we could also do both, and there's no reason. We have now the Podman network update command. There's no reason why we couldn't use this.
Well, it is fair to say let's do it the way we always do it and take bugs when someone doesn't like it. Thoughts?
Yeah, that's our way of doing things for a long time.
Okay.
I change it.
All right. So to the moderator, Tom, I think we've got consensus. Just to pare it back, since I took the first to do, I'll take both, which is that there'll be a card representing work we can do today, which is the plumbing, and then the actual hard switch would be planned in a card for 5.0 attached to 5.0 epic. Fair enough?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Back to you, Tom.
Ready. And that is all that we had on the agenda other than the open discussion. So I'll open it up for anybody to ask any kind of question that they may have. Max, I think you had mentioned you might have something.
We can't hear you.
Okay, it's not me. I'm having problems with audio.
Max, you had stated earlier that you had a question. Did you want to ask that?
Oh, if
He
you
is
can
answering
hear us,
in
Matt,
chat.
can you type it
For-
in chat? Technology, you gotta love it. He's wondering about the WireGuard PR.
And Max, I believe this would be, you can nod. This would be for Aardvark. Sorry, Netavark. Yeah. Okay. So what I remember, and I've been pulled off to a different thing to work on here, and my brain got cleansed. But what I remember is we had suggested we could merge it, but market it, merge it as is, but market experimental, while Paul works on the plugin plumbing, and then just do a quick re-implementation of that code into the plugin, which I volunteered we would do since we were the ones changing things. That's what my memory was. To Paul, is that also your memory?
Yes, I think we could have a separate discussion if it needs to be a plugin or built in. But right now, I think the state is nobody reviews the PR because time. At least that was my consensus. Like, or maybe
okay.
I know like I think where Max is getting in, he pinged me a couple of times. The PR is out there, it's working mostly, but it needs a review, and it's a lot of code, and a review like this takes time for me because I need to test it. I'm not a WireGuard expert. I don't think we have any WireGuard expert on this team.
Yeah.
So
likely where it spooks everyone off.
Yeah.
Which is why I was sort of suggesting we could, merge it and then have a build flag or something that would allow for it to be there until we got our hands around it. But we also did, Paul, we talked about if WireGuard went in, then it's likely we're going to get suggestions that we should support or take PRs for similar applications.
Yeah. So like merging it and Netherwork wouldn't be like a big deal or problem. Like like marking it experimental or something, it's like integration in Podman, like Common and then Podman. That's where it gets a bit more tricky. How do you mark this in Podman as experimental, for example? It's
Mm-hmm. Okay. So number one, we can get people to review it. Matt, why don't you and I go through it as well?
Yeah, sure. Link it to me after lunch, and I will give it a look over.
Okay. And how about if we don't have changes, we'll merge it, and then as a team we can talk about what to do, but at least it'll get in there, and we can decide whether we would release it as part of a Metamark release or hold it back, but it'll get in. Thank you, Max, for your patience and work. It is a lot of code, to be fair. So you did a lot of work. Paul, do you recall if there was enough documentation on that? On how to use it?
You use the plugins, or what do you mean?
WireGuard itself, like Valentin really wants to test WireGuard, but I know he doesn't know anything about it. So how would he know how to do this?
We need to write docs, I guess, but
Okay.
I think the approach taken is like the most common way, like having this WireGuard config file, which is used by the command line tool from WireGuard, where like if you use WireGuard, you pretty much know what to do. I wouldn't say in that way. I think that's fair to say. But it's probably, there must be some upstream documentation from WireGuard where the stuff is described, the config file and stuff like that.
Okay.
And yes, thank you for your work on that today.
Yes.
Great, I think we're done talking about that subject. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments? Not hearing a whole lot. So I'm going to give it one more shot. Any last questions, comments? Right, if anybody has any topics for the next meeting, this would be a good time for that as well. And otherwise, I'll just give a gentle reminder that our next meeting's coming up. We have the next meeting for the Cabal is on Thursday, March 16th, 11 a.m. for that one. And our next community meeting, which is more about demos and showing things that the products can do, is on Tuesday, April 4th. And we hope to see you there for that one too. That's also at 11 a.m. and both are Eastern time. We'll be not on we'll be on daylight savings time for the April meeting. I'm not sure about the March meeting. I think we're daylight savings then too. I'll have to double. So with that, thank everybody for their discussions today. And stop the recording.